I want to begin by sharing a story. This story is not my own, but a story that preliminary participants Mystic and Dee shared with me for this study. Mystic and Dee are mother and daughter, nature enthusiasts, and frequent crowded park users. Mystic has a mobility restriction and uses a walker when visiting parks. The first question is, will there be enough accessible parking spots? Will Mystic have to stay in the car and observe nature from afar? How long will it take to park? The stress of it all often leads Dee and her mother Mystic to turn around and try again another day. Sometimes it felt as though nature's wonders shut down. No birds to be found, no chipmunks scampering across paths. At popular park attractions, personal space was invaded, leaving other visitors rushed and bitter in a place that was supposed to be friendly, open, and an escape from daily life. Management closed popular visitor spots like lookout pull-offs, sometimes the only accessible options for visitors like Mystic to get a noteworthy view. When tensions ran high, visitors were quick to upset as Mystic and Dee drove up to a remote, accessible parking spot. They remarked, "You can't park here," before seeing the accessibility placard in Dee and Mystic's vehicle. Sometimes Mystic and Dee avoided visiting popular parks in summer altogether, finding joy of the off-season and all of nature's wonder. It was clear to myself, as well as Dee and Mystic, that the impacts of park crowding aren't created equal for all park visitors, specifically for people with mobility disabilities and their families. This story leads me to my thesis topic. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you all for being here today. I'm presenting here today at Vancouver Island University on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation. I'm happy to be here today sharing my thesis project titled Exploring the Lived Experiences of Park Crowding for People with Mobility Disabilities, an Interpretive Phenomenological Study. First, it's important to explain why I chose and how I chose to define parks in the context of my study, as it's key to understanding the scope of my study. Although originally I aimed to discuss parks outside of urban city centers, such as rural or countryside parks, parks in the outskirts of city centers, it became clear that experiences of crowding happened frequently in more urban parks as well. However, all parks in the context of the study incorporated both natural features and the built environment. It's important to preface my study emphasizing that park visitors have various physical and cognitive abilities and have different relationships with parks based on past experiences, cultural norms, and their geographic areas. Here, the term park user is defined more broadly than it has been historically. In a review of literature on the benefits of parks, scholars have reported many benefits of parks for people with and without disabilities, such as physical, mental, and social benefits. Park crowding occurs when the number of people in a park space is defined as too many. Some scholars view park crowding as when a park hits its visitor capacity, while others see this as a highly subjective and immeasurable experience. In my study, crowding is conceptualized as social crowding, termed by Stokels in 1972. Considering the social impacts of park crowding, focusing on individual and subjective experiences. Park crowding is considered a negative evaluation of the number of people in that space. It's a normative and socially constructed concept. It's also a competition for resources, and a lack of personal space is a common symptom. Difficulty moving through the area, uncomfortable social interactions, but park crowding perceptions haven't been yet explored in depth for people with disabilities. Which leads me to my next topic. Now, by popular definition, people with disabilities experience a condition or impairment that can make it more difficult for them to engage in activities or participate in the world around them. But more importantly, disability is a part of being human and can vary throughout one's life from one day to the next. It's not always a simple binary term divided into disabled or not disabled. It exists on a spectrum. 6.2 million Canadians over 15 have a disability, and 2.7 million have a mobility-related disability. So it does make sense that park scholars and practitioners have begun to explore ways to make parks more physically accessible and socially inclusive to people with disabilities and their families. The fact scholars have focused on the physical and social environments of outdoor recreation reflects the purpose of Mike Oliver's social model of disability, which guided practitioners to stop viewing disability as a medical problem to be fixed, but rather view disability as caused by the built and social ableist environment. Thus, we must aim to alter the environment to improve the park experience. However, crowded park experiences haven't been explored as an issue of accessibility or inclusivity in parks. And these gaps led me to explore the experiences of park crowding for people with mobility disabilities specifically. I sought to explore this phenomenon in depth, the phenomenon of park crowding, and see how people with mobility disabilities experienced it. I didn't just want to explore that. I had more specific goals in mind. The first being, how do people with mobility disabilities experience park crowding? How do they negotiate park crowding and deal with that? But importantly, how can park management facilitate positive experiences for people with mobility disabilities and many others when crowding does occur? The approach to my study was largely impacted by my positionality, that is, who I am as a person and what my past experiences have been on the topics of my thesis. In qualitative research, it's considered essential to be aware of one's own biases and how that may impact the results of my study. I'm a non-disabled, cisgendered white female. My experiences in outdoor recreation have been shaped by these characteristics. My experiences in parks have been positive and relatively barrier-free throughout my life. I also have experience working with people with disabilities in the community and some experience working on accessibility projects for the federal government and the US National Park Service. My paradigm as a researcher is shaped by my relativist ontology. Ontology expresses a researcher's beliefs about the nature of reality. Thus, I believe an actual objective reality doesn't exist and that it can only be studied and understood through the subjective and individual lenses of each human being. Epistemology is what one believes to be knowledge and how knowledge comes to be. And I believe that each person comes to know their world based on their own subjective interpretations, and I recognize intersectionality of various identities. My belief about the role of values in my research, known as axiology, are that I can't conduct research separate from my own values and beliefs, assumptions, and knowledge, although I may try. This means I also heavily valued participants' emotions and experiences throughout this process. Reflecting my personal research paradigm, interpretive phenomenology, the approach I took in this study, very much aligned with these values. Interpretive phenomenology is an exploration of the lived experiences with the phenomenon, specifically in relation to one's socio-cultural existence or life world, as coined by Martin Heidegger. It can also explore how the phenomenon affects the participant or person's relationship with others and experiences of their body. As recommended by phenomenological scholars, I aim to recruit participants with rich lived experiences with the phenomenon of park crowding and people who shared a significant characteristic, in this case, mobility disability, and specifically the use of a mobility device. I first contacted local organizations on Vancouver Island in person or by email, specifically organizations that facilitated outdoor recreation activities for people with disabilities. Some organizations shared directly with specific members and others on their social media. I also attended a couple of local events held for people with disabilities and their families, and was able to chat with people and present my study proposal to a local advisory committee and an organization forum as well. Once initial participants were interviewed, I asked them to reach out to at least 2 people they thought might be interested and qualified to participate. A couple of times I received name and contact, but most often all participants were recruited by initial organization contact. The first 3 semi-structured interviews took place in parks of the participant's choice on Vancouver Island, BC, and the next 4 on Zoom. Interviews were on average an hour and 12 minutes and took place from July to October 2022. Participants include 7 diverse female participants, ages 23 to 75, Josie, Alex, Mary, Shirley, Lynn, Sam, and Cab, all of whom self-identified as having a mobility disability and used a mobility device for daily movement through space. Participants utilized a range of devices, some using more than one for different occasions. This included a manual and power assist wheelchairs, power assisted adaptive mountain bikes, scooters, walkers, rollers, and canes. The semi-structured interview guide was based off of Bevan's structure in 2014. This involves 3 sections, the 4th in which I added to move closer to practical implications of my study. The first, being contextualization, was to better understand participants as an individual person, involved questions such as, why do you visit parks and what do you expect out of a park environment? The second, apprehending the phenomenon, was to get an idea of how the participant thought of park crowding, such as explaining it on its own, as well as social aspects of park crowding. The third, clarifying the phenomenon, asked participants to reflect on variable levels of crowding in parks, So they were asked to reflect on an empty park, a mildly populated park, and an extremely crowded park. The fourth was a section that I added myself to get closer to practical implications of this study. This involved conversations about staff interactions, crowded parking lots, and crowded park trails. Interview scripts were transcribed verbatim, including any stutters, interjections, and other notes taken during the interviews. I listened to each interview twice, once while the transcription software ran, and the second time to edit the text. Through these stages listed here, each transcript was also read in its entirety once more during stages 1 and again in stage 2. Each interview was analyzed one at a time, following steps 1 through 4, and then all together in step 5. After conducting the cross-case analysis, after reviewing and analyzing each interview, coming up with personal experiential themes, I was able to find 4 main themes. So the first theme here was bodily experiences with space. Now, while navigating in crowded parks, especially in spaces where traffic created a bottleneck, near entrances and attractions of note, participants elaborated on experiences of their body or self in crowded park spaces. The theme, bodily experiences with space, had 2 sub-themes. The first, taking up more space than others, where participants perceived themselves to take up more space than those not using a mobility device in crowded parks. Using your body and device to make more space, the second sub-theme, participants needed to use more forceful measures to protect their space or make more space to negotiate the constraints of crowding. For example, participant Josie reflected on the space that she and her companion occupied when using a 3-wheeled adaptive mountain bike. The space they occupied elicited a reaction from awaiting users. Josie did not interpret this reaction as anger, but one of surprise. And I quote, "But we did like completely block the viewing platform. They'd come running down toward the viewing platform, talking and making noise and stuff, and then they'd stop dead at the top of the stairs. They'd say, 'Oh,' then they'd turn around." Josie noted this occurrence as a surprising reality that when accessible features almost always seem, even though they help so many people who aren't disabled, to be designed for one person. The second theme that emerged was on the helpful and harmful presence of crowd members. When asked to recall experiences of crowding in parks, participants were also asked to reflect on or imagine the opposite of crowding, an empty park. Participants recounted numerous interactions with other park users, whether that be positive remarks of support or negative experiences of ignorance, ultimately underlining the importance of social interactions for one to have a high-quality crowded park experience. The first sub-theme, security in the presence of others and risk alone, revealed that a lack of crowding was actually a concern for some participants. Participants shared their experiences having a helping hand from others in parks, but also their fear or discomfort of being alone in a park without anyone around. Sub-theme 2, the troublesome behaviors make the crowd less tolerable, explored participants' experiences with negative crowd member behavior in parks, highlighting patronizing or ableist interactions. For example, when asked how she would feel in a completely empty park, Lynn stated, "I'm pretty vulnerable as someone with a disability. Typically, I would have to have someone with me just to maneuver. Being a woman and going to a park alone, if you're basically disabled and you're a woman, and you're going to a park with not many people there, I definitely wouldn't do it without someone you knew around." Although not all participants directly stated a feeling of vulnerability and were not inherently vulnerable, Lynn touched on what is commonly referred to as intersectionality, where numerous intersecting characteristics or identities, such as gender and ability, may pose for unique lived experiences and at times increase compounding effects of associated constraints. The third theme focused on experiences of invisibility and visibility in the phenomenon of park crowding. These experiences were grouped into 3 sub-themes. The first being reduced visibility, where participants discussed how crowding impacted their ability to see. The second, feeling invisible, where participants felt unseen and found a way to make their presence known. And the third, feeling like a spectacle, where participants discussed feeling especially seen by other crowd members. Shirley described an unfavorable view, obstructed by other crowd members who were not using mobility devices. She stated, viewpoints and things, we just end up looking at everybody's backside. So having a path or a place where people in wheelchairs can comfortably get with their mobility aid, where I'm not having some tourist step back without looking and fall in my lap. Her park experience was negatively impacted by crowded viewpoints, where others standing blocked her view. Although in crowding literature, one's height was listed as a factor in crowded event experiences, it wasn't further highlighted as it was in this study here and in Shirley's experience. Alex, on the other hand, explained how she felt vulnerable based on her lack of visibility to others in crowded parks. She stated, "If there are a lot of folks around, I can feel a little bit vulnerable. I'm down at this level, and I mean that puts me quite a ways down at a lower level. So people looking around don't always look down and see me. I worry a tiny little bit about folks banging into me or bumping me." Just as participants in this present study shared, other studies have also shown that some people who are using mobility devices have felt unseen, invisible, or out of the visual field, such as in Gates-Reyes's 2015 study. To account for this, many participants in my personal study also negotiated space verbally by making their presence known or by their companions doing so. Theme 4, park infrastructure as an accomplice to crowding. Throughout previously mentioned themes here and in various sections throughout participant interviews, inadequate park infrastructure was revealed as something that limited or further challenged people's crowded park experience. This included infrastructure, such as basic structures that have been created to serve the local population, such as roads and trails. Two sub-themes related to park infrastructure were discovered. The first being how park structures acted as a symbol of exclusion for participants, and the second discussing how participants felt unable to escape crowds in parks due to the limitations of infrastructure. When asked if the number of people present changed how welcome she felt in parks as a person with a disability, participant Shirley responded, "If the infrastructure isn't there, then I don't consider myself super welcome. It's almost like the more people that are there and the less infrastructure is almost a bigger slap in the face than if there's just a lot of people. Like there's all these people that are welcome, but we're not." Here, Shirley emphasized that it was not the number of people that mattered to her, but the impression that park structures left on her park experience. The lack of parking spots signified a lack of accessibility, but the social aspect was clarified as a feeling of rejection. Now, after wrapping up the themes that were revealed throughout my study, to address a common concern of disability research, I ensured my study would also have practical implications to improve the lived experiences of people in crowded parks. Thus, I compiled 15 suggestions to park management and planners to improve the crowded park experience, and these were divided into 6 categories and were based off of participant responses. Parking, for example, keeping unauthorized vehicles and even park staff from using accessible parking spots for quick park access, and ensuring that when vehicle traffic is reduced to mend crowding impacts, people with accessibility placards still have access to drive to those existing lots. Trails and pathways, for example, keeping trails clear of stationary people and debris, keeping people moving, and designing pull-off spaces for rest and passing. Bathrooms, for example, ensuring busy bathrooms are free of biohazardous waste and slip hazards, as some people with disabilities will not be able to easily maneuver around or remove these hazards. Signage, for example, alerting of upcoming narrow sections and tight turns to allow people to be better prepared or decide when it's time to turn around, depending on the level of crowding in that area. Other features of the built environment, such as increasing the amount of shade structures, as some people with spinal cord injuries can't regulate their body temperature, and thus in crowded and hot summer months, a place to be shaded from the sun is extremely important. Technological features such as offering live crowding cameras, specifically of parking lots, trails, and popular attractions, could allow people to make an educated decision or better prepare for their visit. A few other interesting points that I wanted to bring up that participants mentioned were a few things that I wasn't expecting during this study. The first was that some participants discussed park events and concerts. Parks are really popular places for local events such as concerts, and those are often places that crowding is um, quite expected and quite known. So that could be an area for future research as well. Creative parking was also another area where people are parking on the sides of the road, for example. This isn't something that's always available to everyone, especially if you have a mobility device, for example, that you have to take out of the car. But this is something that was brought up by a participant and would be interesting to look at further as well. Another aspect of park crowding that was surprising to me was the concept of online park crowding. one participant mentioned that when you're waiting in queues online or on the phone to get a reservation for campsites, this is a form of park crowding as well that doesn't happen in person, but may negatively impact people differently. Another aspect was with park crowding was standing wheelchairs, which may have offered someone an opportunity to see above the crowd. So to conclude my study, it's important to consider park crowding to achieve park accessibility and inclusion. The essence of crowding varied across lived experiences, but many commonalities between participants were discovered. Although parks that participants could access were home to natural features, park environments coexisted with elements of the built environment and human behavior. And when the built environment and the people within it are influenced heavily by ableism, it's evident that factors affecting full participation do exist. However, many of those constraints were negotiated. Experiences of park crowding were complex and not consistently negative. For example, safety in the presence of others, safety in numbers, and positive interactions with crowd members. Thus, the true indicators of inclusivity in crowded parks remained bound to the people present and the design of the built environment. Thus, park management can play a role in addressing these. Solutions should aim to make physical and social change and allow park practitioners to use an inclusion lens when addressing new park problems that come up, just like crowding. It's not enough to say people could, in theory, access a park, but we must continue to focus on the quality of the park experience and the environment that exists. We must find affordable and timely solutions in addition to more long-term social change in parks. I really want to sincerely acknowledge the 7 generous participants who took the time to so openly share their experiences with me. My supervisory team, I really want to thank them all for supporting me along the way, as well as the supporting organizations that were helping me get participants and supporting this along the way. I also want to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for supporting this study through the Canada Graduate Scholarship. Thank you so much, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or concerns. I'm happy to continue the conversation about this topic. Thank you.